Bruchim Habayim, welcome back to Tuesday Night Learning. We are delighted that you have joined us this evening and delighted to welcome back David Makovsky, who's in conversation with Matti Friedman on the topic of the cohesion of Israeli society at a time of extreme internal stress. Both of our speakers are return guests, return visitors to our Shaar Hashomayim learning programs. And this evening's topic, of course, is of great interest to us, both because of our interest in what is happening in the Jewish state in Israel, and also in terms of our own community as a reflection of overall society and what brings us together, what creates a cohesive community, whether it's the internal stress or it's the external threats, or ideally would be the sense of vision and motivation for bringing people together in a unified sense. We look forward to learning together this evening, to hearing more about this topic. And it's my pleasure now to turn it over to co-chair of Tuesday Night Learning, Louis Dabrin, who will introduce this evening's guests. Thank you. Bruchim Habayim. Welcome.
Rabbi, ladies and gentlemen, Matti Friedman, born and raised in Toronto, made Aliyah at 17 years old. He has written 3 bestsellers, The Aleppo Codex, Pumpkin Flowers, and Spies of No Country, which garnered him several awards. He is a regular essayist for the New York Times opinion section. In our series of Tuesday Night Learning this past March, Matti was featured in conversation with Gideon Zellemeyer on the topic Israel and the Media. I loved that conversation. Matti gets it. He is savvy and the clearest of thinkers. He grasps the subtleties and nuances of Israeli society. Interestingly, his new book, Who by Fire, War, Atonement, and the Resurrection of Leonard Cohen, recounts the never-before-told story of Leonard Cohen's 1973 tour of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Like many of our congregants, I could never hear enough about Israel, and I never mind a repeat performance from someone who is as smart and insightful as Matti. I was determined to make this fall's Tuesday Night Learning lineup extraordinary because, and now I'm making it public, I am retiring from Tuesday Night Learning after 15 years. 25 years if you count the years of my chairing adult education. I do, however, want to leave on a high note. With Matti's blessing, I reached out to my friend David Makovsky to join the evening. Over 23 years ago, I had the good fortune of taking several classes given by David during my 2 years of Jewish learning at the Wexner Heritage Foundation. David wowed me then and has done so ever since with his encyclopedic knowledge, mastery of detail, and passionate presentation on all matters pertaining to the Middle East. David is in the big league. He is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Project on the Middle East Peace Process at the Washington Institute. Since 2000, he's also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. David is a lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies. His commentary on the Arab-Israeli conflict has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and Foreign Affairs. He appears frequently in the media to comment on the Middle East, including on PBS NewsHour. A graduate of Columbia and Harvard, he's a former executive editor of the Jerusalem Post, was diplomatic correspondent for Israel's leading daily Haaretz, as well as a former contributing editor to U.S. News and World Report. This is David's 4th visit to the Shaar. Personally, I cannot hear him often enough. This past December, he spoke in conversation with Charles Brofman. In October 2019, he spoke on his superb book, co-authored with Dennis Ross, Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. That was not their first collaboration. Together, this amazing duo wrote the 2009 bestseller, Myth, Illusions, and Peace, Finding a New Direction for America in the Middle East. David is extremely likable, warm, a mensch, and of course, brilliant. Tonight, he will be in conversation with Matti Friedman, speaking to us about the cohesion of Israeli society at a time of extreme internal stress. But honestly, I can listen to these two speak about anything, so this conversation has no boundaries. David will commence the conversation with opening remarks. David, the floor is yours.
It's a delight to be with you in Montreal with people at Shaar, Hashomayim in Montreal. I'm used to doing this in person. Louis Dobrin is an amazing impresario of these events, and I consider him a friend of many years. And also I want to thank for the generous introduction. Very kind of you. So I hope next time we get to see each other in person. But for now, we have to do it on Zoom. But thank you for having me virtually. I want to try to get to really in the time that we have to really have a sense of where some of the big challenges are for the new government led by Naftali Bennett in Israel. It's now just a few months into his term, and there's a lot of challenges. There are domestic challenges, and maybe we'll talk about that in the conversation with Matti Friedman, a colleague. It's an honor to be with Matti, who's really a leading journalist and observer of Israeli society. But I'm going to really talk about more some of the foreign policy challenges. We know that there's a government that was born after 4 months of 4 rounds of elections where there was deadlock, and it's a real experiment in Israeli political life. Basically, it's a sense of a hybrid government, whether right, center, left. Imagine, as I tell American audiences, something where you had a President Joe Biden, but the Secretary of State would have been Mitt Romney, and the Secretary of Defense might have been Ted Cruz. It's not exactly analogous in an American context, but basically, it's an amazing experiment to say, can we work together as the government of Israel on consensus issues? And Prime Minister Netanyahu is in the opposition, is ironically the glue that keeps the government together. We'll get back to this at the end, but there are many issues that are of consensus, and that's what government is dedicated to, that proposition that they can find a way to deal with consensus issues. These are issues that are not necessarily consensus issues in the world, but they are in Israel. So one of them, the first, I would say, Israelis would agree, is Iran. And when we're talking about foreign policy challenges, basically you have a new government in Iran led by Ibrahim Raisi. He was just elected in August, succeeding Hassan Rouhani. He's known as very hardline, a religious cleric. The Ayatollah, known as the supreme leader, because he both kind of calls the shots, fires the shots, so to speak, sees him maybe as his successor. He was previously head of the Iranian judiciary. He allegedly played a role in the mass execution between 4,000 and 5,000 political prisoners in the 1980s. He's been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury, and at his UN General Assembly debut just now, he called Israel, of course, predictably, the epithets that Iranians call Israelis all the time. So the question is does he really come back to these talks that are going on in Vienna between world powers and Iran, and get Iran back into what's known as the Iran nuclear deal? Their formal name is JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And is that a good thing or not? Israelis debated. I felt going to Israel, I was kind of surprised by things that I heard from the defense establishment higher up. They had their concerns that Vienna was not a good agreement. That was no surprise, because the U.S. is talking about a longer and stronger deal that would deal with more problematic aspects of the Iranian nuclear program. But the surprise to me was a belief at the top of a sense that it will buy Israel time to reconfigure its defense budget during the decade of the 20s, to upgrade its offensive capabilities. And in that sense, a deal was better than no deal for all the flaws of the deal. Now, others say, look, this deal isn't going to happen. Raisi is just toying with the United States. He's not serious. And when Bennett was here in Washington in August, he publicly called on the U.S. to have a plan B, assuming there is no Vienna. Now, what do you do? And that is something that, and also I should say that Bennett's approach here in Washington is one that's very different than his predecessor, Benjamin Netanyahu. His approach is no fights between friends. Whatever Israel's views are on the nuclear program, and Israel's not hidden that it's concerned about the Vienna talks, about its flaws, is not necessarily to American liking. But there's not going to be a big speech in the U.S. Congress like Netanyahu did in 2015. We're going to try to work behind closed doors to work things out with the United States. That was, I think, one of the key elements where there's a consensus, not just by Bennett, Lapid, the foreign minister, Gantz, the defense minister, and the like. But basically, what he would like, clearly, Bennett, is a plan B that involves Arab states. Now is the United States, Israel, and Arab states are all together under the U.S. Central Command. This didn't used to be possible before the Abraham Accords. Now it is. So there's more. Israel was always in the European Command, ironically, because the Arab armies wouldn't, and their representatives in the United States military would not sit with the Israelis. Now they do. So, Israel clearly would like to build on that. But Israel's main point is that Iran is really developing way beyond JCPOA. Basically, and I don't want to bore you people here, but just try to simplify without being simplistic. To have a nuclear bomb, you need a missile, which clearly Iran has. You need detonators, which the assumption is they have, but you can never find them. They're like needles in a proverbial haystack. But nuclear fuel is the key in really trying to measure where they're at. That's something that's harder to hide, although Iran has tried to do that in mountains like Fordo. It's usually understood that at least at 20% enrichment of uranium, it's reactor grade quality. These are good for, but not weapons grade. What's happened lately is that Iran is enriching at 60% quality. 90% is considered what you need to really have a device, to have the equivalent of a nuclear bomb. Now, a bomb isn't, believe it or not, the same as a weapon because there's a whole weaponization process that you need. Some people believe it'll take another 2 years. And the question is, can you measure it? Israel's view is you don't want to get close to this. And you don't want them to be able to have a device. But they are now there's a whole thing of enrichment with also uranium metal, key in the way to the bomb. So basically, President Biden has said, not on my watch will Iran get a bomb. And he used the word not even developing it. But Israel's saying, all I know is they're not in Vienna and they're playing for time. At what point are these nuclear talks going to be dead? And you're going to think about a plan B. And that's kind of the debate going on now between the U.S. and Israel. Israel said time for plan B because what if they're now sprinting to the finish and it's an expedited timetable? If you had Vienna, you had maybe a decade to reconfigure and upgrade your forces, but here you might not have that if they're in a sprint. No one knows, though, and the U.S. is saying we haven't buried Plan A, so we're not ready for Plan B. So I think these, Raisi's asked for a few months to get organized with his team, but the question is he sincere? Or even if he comes to Vienna, he could come to Vienna and play out the clock and just put forward ridiculous proposals. So we just don't know. Now, all this is going on while Iran is active in the region and Israel is active. And there's basically a shadow war going on between Israel and Iran. It's going on inside Iran. You've seen news reports about power suddenly going off at the enrichment plant in Natanz. People blame Israel. There's been, cyber attacks that have gone on at the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas, even the Iranian trains. Iran has also done some cyber attacks on Israel too. Then there's been some back and forth at sea where ships that are partly owned by Israeli owners there's been some sabotage. And of course, the most important thing is, even outside, I won't say the most important thing, but something that's not nuclear focused, but something that's been going on for years, and Israel's hit thousands of these targets, is this Iranian presence in Syria. It's been called in Israel the war between the wars, or the conflict between the war, the campaign between the wars, which is to try to calibrate under the radar the gray zone, where Israel's saying, look, Israel doesn't want war with Iran in Syria, but at the same time, Israel saw what happened when Iran entrenched itself in Lebanon with Hezbollah in the 1980s. So if you didn't like the book in Lebanon, do you want to see the movie in Syria? And so this has been going on. Israel wants to deny Iran a foothold in Syria. They've been really trying to entrench themselves by being aligned with Hafez al-Assad and his really murderous civil war against his own people. Hundreds of thousands have been killed among the Syrians. They called in Iran to help save the Assad regime, given the alliance between the Assad regime and Iran. Russia's come in as well. And Israel is trying to thread the needle by saying we don't want a full-scale war with Iran. We certainly don't want to get into air fights with the Russians that control the skies, but we don't want to give these people a foothold right on our border. So, and then there's the efforts of what's called the land bridge, where they bring trucks all the way from Iran and bring it into Hezbollah and Beirut, and they go through Syria. So this is a shadow war. It's something maybe you don't read about in the Montreal Gazette or other newspapers, in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, but this is a shadow war that's playing out in different places in the Middle East, given Iran's aspiration to dominate in the region. Now, so that's been some of the challenging news. I'll just say the next section is just the Abraham Accords. You've all heard of it. This effort to normalize relations with Arab states. It was 4 countries in 2020. It was the last year the Trump administration, Netanyahu government, was involved. It really came against the backdrop of the Trump peace plan hitting a wall, and the Emiratis realizing that they could also seize the moment and get some things from the United States on the eve of an election, like F-35s and Reaper drones and things that they've wanted for years but were denied. So they created a certain template that the other Arab states, Bahrain, in its own way, Morocco, Sudan, of each saying, well, for the Emirates, you gave them bilateral goodies, so to speak, to do peace normalization with Israel, us too. So the question is that going to be broadened and deepened by the Biden administration? We'll get to in a minute. But the good news is that this is taken off like a rocket ship, and I wish Shimon Peres was alive. This was, I think, his dream, that peace would not just between governments, but between peoples. There's strategic peace agreements between Israel and Jordan, Israel and Egypt. If you read the treaties, the Egypt Treaty of 79, the Jordan Treaty of 94, a lot of it is like, where does the line go? Where do the armies restricted zones? Because it was the last act in the old chapter of wars between Israel and Arab states. Doesn't mean Israel doesn't face wars. They do. But it's from Hezbollah and Hamas that are non-state actors, or Iran, which isn't Iran, Arab, it's Persia. But this is different. This is not on Israel's border. There's no baggage. These people never fought each other on the battlefield. And they mean it. Peace is taken up. I was just talking to an Emirati diplomat last night, and the Emirates have signed 70 MOUs, memorandums of understandings with Israeli companies. They want this deeply for economic purposes. These are the two most globalized economies in the Middle East. I wouldn't say it's like the equivalent of a deal between Google and Microsoft, but these are two countries that are very globally focused, high-tech oriented. GDP of the Emirates is over $400 billion, and Israel in 2018 was just under that, but by now it's over that. Both have over $40,000 per capita GDP. The Emirates has something which is unfathomable, a $1.3 trillion sovereign wealth fund to really invest in Israeli companies. And it's just starting. The tourism, I think you had 140,000 Israelis that went to the Emirates during a pandemic. This is a country where pre-pandemic, I believe 4.3 million Israelis traveled abroad. They feel they need to get out. They can't exactly drive to their neighbors in Syria or Lebanon. So they like to travel. And here it is, nearby. So I think the possibilities for tourism, the possibilities of trade are enormous. There's a convergence of interest that the Emirates like Israeli technology. They always say to me, David, Israel's a startup nation. We're the scale-up nation. We can help commercialize things and get Israeli products into Asia, Africa, and all sorts of countries. These are two countries that are going to redefine really a peace between peoples in a way that hopefully it'll be emulated by other countries. It helps that the Emirates is so wealthy, I must say, and not every country is. But, they are, whether it's cyber or whether it's medical equipment, whether it's fintech, financial technology, communications, all sorts of things, agriculture, environment, what's called green tech, issues related to food security. I think this is if I was a 20-something-year-old today, I would say, go follow the Emirati-Israeli peace, because the possibilities are really, I think, endless. And at the time people talk of American retrenchment from the Middle East, this is an ability to weave together relationships between pro-American governments. And I hope the Biden administration will think about not just broadening, the Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia is the big prize. And maybe we can get into this later, but that is going to be dependent on the Saudis saying, okay, America, do something for us, which I think is they want to return MBS to respectability in the United States. It's, as a senior U.S. official said to us at the Washington Institute the other day, it's either Yemen or Israel. That is their ticket, as they see it, the Saudis. So could there be partial moves here? Or is there going to be a deepening as well, which is to not just think bilateral, Emirates, Israel, Saudi, Israel, but could there be also a deepening of the machinery of among the normalizing states, old normalizers like Egypt, Jordan, the new normalizers, the four I had mentioned, Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco. Could there be, trade consortiums, climate change? Tony Blinken meeting with Yair Lapid and the Emirati foreign minister to start working groups on some of these issues. This hopefully the regional architecture here will deepen. And there's some who believe the administration is not as committed. Others say it is, but you just got to give it time. We shall see. We're seeing things like also, cyber agreements between Israel and Morocco. We're seeing Israel and Jordan restore a modicum of personal relations. I mean, what's amazing been with Jordan and Egypt, and I saw this personally even on my last trip, like just a couple of weeks before COVID, the Israeli-Jordanian, the Israeli-Egyptian security relationships are outstanding because they all want stability. It's interesting that the military intelligence people that maybe fought Israel in the wars between 48 and 73 are leading the way on on peace in the sense that they are Israel's counterparts. But if you want to broaden it to water, energy, natural gas, which Israel is doing, but you need personal relationships. The relationship between King Abdullah and Prime Minister Netanyahu was very poor, and now they're starting off on a new foot. And I spoke to senior Jordanian cabinet ministers who said, "Hey, David, this is working so far." And now there's been just an announcement that Israel is going to double the amount of water that it is going to be selling to Jordan. So I think that it's not just about will there be Saudi-Israeli peace, but there's different dimensions here for you to follow. The last part I'll say here is what I think is the chance of a new discourse. Look at the slide on the right. These three buildings here. It was dedicated by the Pope in Abu Dhabi just a few years ago. And the idea is to be the only place in the Arab world where there's a synagogue, a church, and a mosque in one place. The synagogue faces Jerusalem. I'm going to be Abu Dhabi to speak at a conference where the Abraham Accord is going to be a major topic. It's hosted by an Arab think tank in November, and I hope to pray at the site. Even though the buildings are not yet complete, I think they'll be done in 2023, but they're certainly on their way. And I think it's interesting, in the Arab world, there's been some TV series even that have been more sympathetic to Jews. In a way, there's been only vitriol and anti-Semitism in the Arab media about Israel, to explain this new track of cooperation. Suddenly, Jews are put in a more sympathetic light. Now, if you ask me, this is going to take a long, long time. I don't want to oversell anything, but I think that this menorah here is in Abu Dhabi too. Here's I think this is Bahrainis coming to the Kotel area. It's a new world, and it's something that for North American Jews in Canada and the U.S., this is something I'm not used to. But I think this is a very dynamic effort going on to make this not just a peace between governments, but a peace between peoples. Now, the Palestinian issue is all familiar to you. There's two pieces here. There's what I would call the gradualism. I don't know, some of you are baseball fans in Canada, maybe not all. And I remember talking to Charles Bronfman about being the owner of the Montreal team, but I sometimes use the baseball metaphor of, the U.S. has tried to hit the home run ball here 3 times. Clinton 2000, Condoleezza Rice's effort 2007-8. I was part of the U.S. peace team led by the Secretary of State in 2013-14, by John Kerry. I don't see the home run. I think when you swing for the fences, you often strike out. I'm not saying, I think these were noble efforts, but I think what you need to do is hit some singles. It's got to be gradual. You need, I've talked to Bennett before he was prime minister 8 or 9 times, where he said to me, David, autonomy on steroids, the A+B areas, those are the Palestinian cities, the environs outside the cities. About 80 plus to 90% of the Palestinians live in this 40% of the West Bank. And so I think you could start there with some private sector. This is something that Bennett said he's keen on doing, but he doesn't want to be the guy to be the front guy because of the nature of his coalition. A lot of his voters are on the right, and he's very happy for Benny Gantz to kind of take the lead. Gantz, after all, is the defense minister, and traditionally the defense ministry are the point people on these issues often. Kogat, they deal with Palestinian civilian affairs. There's the Central Command. They know the Palestinians extremely well. I was in Ramallah this summer when I was in Israel, and they were already telling me within a few days in Ramallah, these are people closest circle to Abbas. David, we're going to want to see Benny Gantz. We trust him. He's a very honest person. We can work with him. So I don't think anyone's going to expect a home run on this issue, but I think there'll be some singles. And we're seeing this also, that Israel is trying to working with the UN and Qatar on, we're going to talk about Gaza in a minute, but how to get vouchers for 100,000 Gaza families. because what happened was the money came to Gaza in suitcases. Hamas diverted the cash for its own purposes. So the idea is not to put cash in Hamas's hands, but to give the money to people who need it, who are poor, and need food. And that's what Israel, the UN, and Qatar are trying to do. There's still some arguments about what about who's going to pay the salaries. And I was just on a session with a senior person at the UN, believe it or not, who said, we are not doing that. That will open us up to legal liability issues. So, this is not easy, but I think there is some reconstruction going on in Gaza. The Egyptians are very helpful in trying to rebuild here. There's a lot to be done. The UN person was very actually optimistic. He said things are moving. It's just that the media isn't writing about it. But it's only a matter of time before the media realizes the story and will focus on the reconstruction going on. But the West Bank, I'll just add one more word. I'm sorry to flip back and forth. But, the whole issue of the Palestinian Authority is that it's very weak right now. Hamas got a lot of the public adulation for taking on Israel over an issue like Jerusalem in May. The PA stayed out of it, which is good that they didn't fight alongside Hamas, who were their bitter rivals. But they are not, they are very tapped out money-wise. COVID has not helped, but it also hasn't helped that Abbas has not put the focus on economics and improving the day-to-day life of his own people. And, he has to look in the mirror here on that. Israel has extended like $150 million loan, but basically they cannot get a major aid from the U.S. Congress unless they change their rules. And that means no pay to slay. That's the American law that says no money can go directly to PA so long as people who sit in Israeli jails are incentivized, so to speak. The longer you're in jail, the more money you get. So that is seen as incentivizing people to violence. By putting these kinds of incentives out there. So he's got to address that. They haven't had an election, since 2006. Parliamentary election, presidential election was 2005. So Abbas is in like the 16th year of a 5-year term. But there's no comparison between the PA and Hamas. The PA works with Israel day in, day out, under the radar on security issues to try to keep Hamas out. It's good for the PA. It's not a favor for Israel, but I think that's a good thing. If things are done for self-interest, they're sustainable over time. And the security cooperation is keeping Hamas out of the West Bank, keeping their cities safe. The last point I'll just talk about, and I don't want to talk too long here, and that is just, the durability of the Bennett government. How long will it last? We don't know. Here's like a list of the different parties in the government. I think it's more, curious to hear Matti's views. I think it's more resilient than people think. In theory, the number is 60. When it was sworn in, 60 votes for, 59 against, and 1 abstention. But in reality, the Netanyahu government really can only count on somewhere between 54, maybe 57 seats. I tend to think it's going to be resilient for these 2 years. The first test is a budget on November 10th. We'll see if that passes. I think it will, because everyone in the government wants achievements. The only way to have achievements is to have a budget. Israel hasn't had a budget for 3.5 years. And Netanyahu felt it was more advantageous to him for there not to be a budget. But I tend to think the Bibi paradox, as I said at the outset, is that this is a government done in reaction to Netanyahu, not because they didn't admire some of the things he did, but they felt with these corruption trials that he was having a negative impact on Israeli institutions and the independent vitality of the judiciary and the law enforcement. whether it was already having an impact or there was an expectation of erosion. The BB paradox is this government is done in reaction to Netanyahu, but actually you need Netanyahu to stay in politics as a looming force, as the glue that keeps this coalition together, because they are not of one ideological brand there. There's right, center, left. It's an unusual combination. You have parties like on the right, you have parties of Bennett and the Justice Minister, Gideon Shaar, the Finance Minister, Victor Lieberman, and you have parties in the center like Lapid and Gantz's centrist parties, and you have parties that are, in America, would be definitely left-wing parties, the Labor Party, the Meretz Party. And for the first time, you have a party, an Arab party, that has even an affiliation as an Islamist party. I sat with Mansour Abbas when I was there, and I was struck by him. I don't know if all the people in his party are like him. I asked him some tough questions. I said, you're in a government with, it's called United Arab List. You see it here on the slide. It's the last party. You're an Islamist party, but there could be something in Gaza you won't like. I mean, you're not a minister, but you're not in the government, but you're in the coalition. And he said, look, we have to be realistic. And, I'm trying something historic here. What he's doing is, unlike the Joint List, these other Arab parties that was involved, that challenged the Jewish character of the state. He doesn't challenge the Jewish character of the state as I see it. He said, I'm a citizen, I want services. We have crime in Arab neighborhoods and no one's focused on organized crime. We want more Israel. We don't want less Israel. He speaks in a language that Israelis can understand, and it is breathtaking, the shift. I'll end with this slide. And Bennett, when he was at speaking to North American Jewish groups in New York on September 27th, he was talking about this hodgepodge, this hybrid government. He said, quote, I never thought it would work. There was a sense of helplessness and despair in the air. If we don't sit together, this thing is going to tear us apart. This time, we're not going to let it tear us fall apart. About 100 days ago, my partners and I formed a new government in Israel, the most diverse government in our history. What started as a political accident can now turn into a purpose, and that purpose is unity. And so he called it beautiful, as you see. So we shall see. There are a lot of challenges ahead. Look, if this was not the Middle East, if this was America, maybe, this idea of saying we're only going to work on consensus issues like the budget, like COVID relief, like infrastructure, like health, like education, that would be just something perfect. That let's focus where we can agree. Bennett himself said 70% agree on 70% of the issues. The problem is it is the Middle East. There's curveballs coming at you every single day from Hezbollah, from Iran, from Hamas. And the question is, it isn't a hermetically sealed laboratory in Switzerland. So can this government withstand those shocks? That's going to be a test. But I think it's a test that those of us who worried about polarization in Israel and worry about polarization in North America, though that's a test that I think we hope will succeed, that polarization could be reduced and that government can work on issues of common cause, regardless of if the parties are right, center, or left. So anyway, I look forward to the discussion with Matti, and we can hopefully kick around these issues some more. Again, I want to salute Louis and your synagogue and for all its lecture series, and it's a delight to be with you. So Matti, over to you.
David, thanks so much for that incredible overview of what's going on, and thanks, of course, to Louis and to Rabbi Shaar for having us at the Shaar. I'm sorry that we can't be there in person. In listening to your presentation, I just couldn't help but want to ask you. You wrote a book recently called Be Strong and of Good Courage, and you look at leadership decisions made by four great Israeli leaders: Ben Gurion, Begin, Rabin, and Sharon. Do you see Naftali Bennett appearing in a future edition of the book?
Look, it's hard to know. It's early days still. Um, you know, in a certain way, Bennett never thought he'd be in this position. When you only have, I don't know, 7, 8 seats, and Matti, you know this well. There could be something liberating about being ahead of a small party. I mean, it's never happened in Israel's history that the prime minister was not the head of the largest party. But it also means that you're kind of liberated from your base, that you're not weighted down by all these commitments to a huge numbers, and that narrows, room to maneuver. He might have more room to maneuver because he could be more nimble. But what all these four did, like, they rose to a challenge. Ben Gurion founded a state. Now, that wasn't a left-right issue. And there was unity in the country. So, in that sense, he wasn't limited. Begin, and I wrote the Ben Gurion and the Begin chapters. Begin had to go against elements of his base. The Camp David Accords only passed because the Labor Party was with him. But Begin himself saw this was a way to end wars. If you can get the biggest Arab state out of the picture, Syria won't go to war alone. You're in a new era, and Begin was right. So there was an ideological element, but still it wasn't the land of Israel. It was the Sinai Desert. Were there settlements? Yes. For that, he couldn't do it just the Likud. He needed labor. But he had more room a little bit because it wasn't the West Bank, I would say. Rabin, didn't, had the halo. He won the 6-Day War. But he paid for his life for this decision on Oslo. That was, he paid the ultimate price. Sharon was pulling out of Gaza where there was a consensus to get out in a certain way, but that meant taking down settlers where there was no consensus. Sharon was a bulldozer, as everyone points out. So there was something unique with these people and kind of acute challenges they face on war and peace. I don't see right now Ben Gurion on war, the other three on peace. I don't see Bennett right now having to face one of those big challenges because, like I said, I don't see a grand deal with the Palestinians in the offing. So I don't know if he's going to be challenged in the same way, but I think the counterintuitive thing is to say, because he's a smaller faction, he might be more nimble. I mean, right now, if you think of his big decisions, it's more as a manager than as a leader. I mean, he really, his big decisions is no lockdowns, not doing that again. Even though there's Jewish holidays where there could be spreader events, he bet on this booster shot idea that saying if people have 3 shots, they're not going to be able to spread it, and the hospitalizations will go down. I watch the Israeli news in Hebrew every day and live, and I always look at hospitalizations, and the numbers are dropping. So I think Bennett is, he's carrying through. That COVID is not a left or right issue. So in that sense, there's no polarization, and I think he's proving himself. The question is what happens when he deals with other issues? For example, limiting the role of the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, with the budget. Is he going to take certain steps where the ultra-Orthodox have to teach math? They have to teach English, what they call the Liba, the core curriculum. That's going to take a lot of guts. Now, he's got a government that doesn't depend on ultra-Orthodox influence. So there are some tough decisions, but it's not the same so far as the war and peace questions. But I think it's very admirable to me that his tone is how do you bring people together? And he's been very consistent in these 4 months. And clearly the opposition, that's what they do. I mean, they're out to get him and all that. But he's tried to stay above the fray and say, okay, what unites us? What unites us? We talk about unity. Let's work there. So I like his tone, but I keep saying, it's the Middle East. It's the Middle East. It's like, and Matti, you've written about this so well, about, Westerners have to be really careful about using their lenses in dealing with some very sticky problems in the Middle East, and being very humble about that. And I 1,000% agree with you in that regard. So he's off to a good start. He's focusing on what he said he would do. He's changing the tone of the country. He's keeping a laser focus on COVID, all the good stuff. But I keep wondering, don't assume it's just going to be like a sailboat swimming, going down the river. In the next 2 years, things can get rocky, whether it's Iran, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Hezbollah.
Right, I agree. I think that he sees the challenge facing the country, maybe the challenge facing all Western countries at the moment, in a way that's correct, which I think not everyone is onto yet. The challenge, I think, in 2021 is preserving a collective that is capable of acting together toward a common goal. That was taken for granted, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and it can no longer be taken for granted. And what we see in Israel with this incredible experience of deadlock over, a period of 2 or 3 years, where there's no conclusive result of the election, there's no budget, as you mentioned, where people are at each other's throats and people seem to see their fellow citizens as the enemy. And you see a similar situation, of course, in the United States. That is what threatens democracies more than external threats. So the idea that there's going to be some kind of dramatic peace agreement with the Palestinians is not on the table, although there are other interesting things going on elsewhere in the region, as you pointed out. But the challenge is, can we have a state? Can we have joint institutions? For example, an army. Can people who disagree agree that, when we're 18, we're going into the army and we're going to get an order and we're going to follow that order? I don't think we can take that for granted at all, here or in the United States. And I think Bennett really is correct in his identification of that as the problem that needs to be attacked. And the coalition, which I think is a creature of necessity. It's not like anyone would have chosen this kind of, 9-headed monster or whatever it is. The upside of that is that it's really kind of a coalition for our age. And if you can make it work with, Ayelet Shaked, who's a hard right character, and Mansour Abbas, who is, as you mentioned, a religious, conservative Muslim. If that can work, then a lot of things can work, and that is reason for hope, which we need. It's been a rough year in many ways, and in that regard, I think we have reason for some optimism.
Oh, I think in the past, all the wars it submerged some of these. River likes to call it the political tribes, whether that's the best way to call it, we could discuss it. But the fact of the day-to-day wars, you have wars 48, 56, 67, 73, 82 with Lebanon. The two intifadas, those overwhelming challenges, immediate, primal challenges meant that the sociology of Israel and all that was kind of subjugated to the imperative of survival, of physical survival. But what do you do the more Israel is becoming more established in a good way? Of course, it still has the challenges, but some of the differences are emerging, and it's not just differences of places of origin, but this whole polarization and this sense of not putting the national good above the needs of your group, whether they're ultra-Orthodox or Arab or Russian or whatever they are. So I think I 1,000% agree with you that this is a really important effort that's going on, and people are, in America, I know Canada as well, but we got so many other things here, not just with COVID, but other issues that people aren't paying attention. And I just tell people, pay attention. This is an amazing experiment. If there could be a broad-based effort to focus on these consensus issues, lower the temperature, refocus on the national institutions and the sense of a common purpose, then I think hopefully other countries, maybe here in our country, in the U.S., might emulate it as well. But it's an important experiment going on in Israel.
Yeah, we all definitely need it to work. So I think that is really the main challenge for us domestically at the moment. And I would say that you touched on this as well, and you've touched on it elsewhere. That the challenge, I think, for people looking at Israel from the outside, including Jews who sympathize with Israel and identify with Israel, is to move our understanding of Israel from the classic European lens in which we've always viewed the history of the state to the lens of the Middle East. And it's a tricky leap to make when the North American Jewish community is so overwhelmingly Ashkenazi or of European, East European origin. Montreal is actually interesting in that way because it has a strong North African component, including my brother-in-law, his family. So Montreal is maybe a bit different, but it's We've always told this story about Israel, which is very much about Europe. So you have pogroms in Eastern Europe, and you have Herzl in Vienna, and you have the kibbutz idea and socialism, and of course the Shoah, and then Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, and these great characters, which we still associate as the heroes of the state. But at least half of the citizens of Israel, the Jewish citizens of Israel, don't come from Europe. Right. They come from the Middle East and North Africa, and even those Israelis who are of European descent, the Ashkenazim, as we say over here, they've been in the Middle East for 2 or 3 generations. So Israel's story is a Middle Eastern story. It's not a story about the Warsaw Ghetto. It's a story about Kurdistan. We have to make a leap from understanding Israel as something that comes out of the world of Europe to understanding it as something that exists in the world of the Middle East, in a world that's occupied by players like the Iranians, like the Emiratis, like the Jordanians, like the Moroccans. It's a different world of the world of North America, and I think that's one reason for the growing gap in understanding that you see certainly among the opponents of Israel, who tried to kind of remake Israel as a symbol of American problems, American racial problems, or to remake Israel as a symbol of apartheid, which is a South African problem. But it's harder as well for supporters of Israel who still think of Israel as kind of a heroic story about the kibbutz. Those are stories that I love, but they're no longer relevant, and our understanding really needs to move toward the Jewish experience in the Middle East, which is not.
By the way, just to your
problem.
Right? Am I right, Matti, that we talk about the majority of Israelis not being Ashkenazic? It's just so ironic that in this country you've had some critics coming, from a certain direction, talking about Israel as a white privilege when, the majority of Israelis are not white. I had a black progressive member of Congress say to me, David, don't they realize there's all these Sephardic Jews there? There's Ethiopian Jews. There's all these. How come that doesn't get the media attention? And this is, his name is Richie Torres. He said this on, I think, the Bill Maher show. So it's there's a lot of ironies here, and there's this certain laziness, I think, of people not drilling down to look at the sociological, the ethnic composition of Israel that, as you say, is in transition. And maybe I could ask you, Matti, a question about, I'm not just saying this. I've told others, I see you as a keen observer of society. And I lived there late in the mid 80s to the year 2000. I go back 3-4 times a year. Now my new thing is now to go to the Emirates and then hopefully go to Israel afterwards and become like a circle. And I usually go to Ramallah also. But I'm just struck how Israel is changing in a dramatic way. It's become more affluent, and there's a lot of poverty. Don't get me wrong. I know the Haredi neighborhoods. I know the development towns, but the high tech is only, you could say, 15% of the workers or less are in that are kind of raising Israel's standard of living. But Israel is not the Israel. It seems like it's dynamic, but it's, maybe I'm middle-aged, so I say it's more middle-aged in the sense of it's the country used to be, people were honking their horns, blowing smoke at you, cutting in line, screaming and getting, cutting and getting on buses. It seems that the country is becoming also more middle class in a certain way, with those traits that we associate with the middle class. And I wonder also, with the globalization, while I share your views that, it's not like, this isn't an extension of Long Island or something like that. It's not the 51st state. But I find that I don't use the word provincial. They're more aware of what's going on in the world, and maybe being so hot wired into the technology as part of it. It's just on day-to-day stuff. It seems like Israel is not, and you can say it's a function of the wars, a function of being accepted more in the Arab world, but it doesn't feel as besieged in the same way. It doesn't feel. It feels more like a country that is becoming more established and more. It's fine-tuning itself. But it's not in any sort of revolutionary ferments or even ideological ferments. The fact that all these parties are sitting in one government tells me that they feel, okay, the ideology is nice, but it might not be decisive. And again, I'm not, I could tell you each sector, the settlers and the Haredim, and I'm not here to say that Israel's not ideological at all. It's not true. But I'm just saying there's certain subtle changes that seem to me in the last 30 years that the country is not the same country. I don't know how you see it.
Oh, absolutely. I came to Israel in 1995. I was 17 years old. And so that was 26 years ago. And it's a different country. The pace of change here is unbelievably fast. I mean, everywhere is changing, but this place is so dynamic and so new that I think there's a lot more mobility and there's just it's a more fluid society than the one I grew up in Toronto, for example. Things change here much more quickly. People move around. People are down, go up. People up, come down. It's that kind of place. There's an electricity here that's quite unique. The old ideologies have kind of played themselves out, I think. I mean, I think in many ways, Zionism as we, know it has achieved its goal, and Israelis are kind of wandering around not knowing what's next. There's been an ideological vacuum here, I would say since 2000, in a kind of cosmic way. The year 2000 marks this deep change in Israel. There's this great attempt to solve the Israel-Arab conflict at Camp David in the year 2000. Israel pulls out of South Lebanon in the spring of 2000. Ehud Barak is the prime minister, and he's trying to get a peace deal with the Syrians, and that is supposed to crown the Zionist project, which is how the moderate Zionists, the mainstream Zionists, always imagined it. We thought we were moving into a new Middle East of peace and economic prosperity, and you remember it all, and of course you were involved in it, and then it collapses. The whole thing collapses, and the peace process blows up, and suicide bombings start, and then it's 9/11, and the Americans are in Iraq, and Iraq collapses, and then a lot of other countries collapse, and we're in a new Middle East, but not the one we imagined. The last kibbutznik prime minister, the last representative of that, great kind of Zionism, he loses power, Ehud Barak, in early 2001, and that's pretty much it for the kibbutz movement, and for that Israel, and then a vacuum is created in Israel. And then there's no ideological, battle of the kind that we were used to between socialists and, capitalists, or between left and right, really, because the left basically collapses and Israelis are just existing in this very tough neighborhood in the Middle East. And then they start making economic progress, and high tech starts happening, some cultural electricity starts happening. And over the past 20 years, Israel's had remarkable success in many areas, and in many ways, the country has never been in better shape. But in terms of where we're going, in terms of a shared vision of what the country could be, we're in terrible shape, in my opinion. And a country like Israel can't really hack it without a vision. It's not Canada. Canada can kind of coast indefinitely. Not Israel. The place is too demanding, and we need a leadership that speaks a language that people understand. We need a leadership that can kind of sketch where this is going and why it's worth the sacrifices that we're all expected to make. And we haven't had that over the past decade or two, and that is really the kind of the vacuum at the heart of the country at the moment. And I think that's a reason for some of the feeling of malaise that you'll encounter here, when in many ways things have never been better. Security has in many ways never been better. The economy has definitely never been better, but there's a feeling of malaise that's, I think, related to that loss of shared vision. And it's ironic when you look at the Israeli political system, as you mentioned, or at the Israeli public, which no longer disagrees on very much. What you said about 70% of Israelis agreeing on 70% of the issues, that's true. It might even be an understatement. I think that most of the Knesset, 80 members of Knesset could probably exist in the same political party without too much difficulty. But we have these old ideas about identity and old arguments that we're still conducting, even though the differences on the issues no longer exist. So in many ways, we're doing great, and in other ways we're not doing great. And I think that what we're lacking is a kind of a Zionism 2.0. What is this project now that it has succeeded? What does it mean to have a Jewish state in the Middle East? Does that mean that we're waiting for the Arab world to sign a beautiful peace agreement with us? Does it mean that we're all going to support the settlement project now? We're all going to be settlers, and are we going to be ultra orthodox? I mean, none of those are really viable ways forward for most Israelis, and what that viable way is, we're still waiting for leadership to emerge to tell us.
All right, but let me. I know we're coming towards the end of our time, but let me just say why I'm maybe. I know you're over there and I'm not. So I I'm more optimistic on the future of direction in terms. I am very much concerned about. We didn't really get into the whole two-state solution thing, and I know all the unpopularity of solving this, and I said it myself, no home runs now. But I mean, the negative part is I am concerned that if Israel does move to a one-state element, it will lose a lot of support in this country that I think is really going to have an impact. I'm worried even about the American Jewish community. I don't know the Canadian Jewish community in the same way, but I somehow have faith in the resilience of Israel. I'll tell you why. Look, I see all the odds Israel's come from, 48 till now. I mean, Ben Gurion could never have imagined the Arab states opening up the way it has. The GDP. I mean, just the technology being like almost a technological superpower. He could have imagined it. So, look, any vision on Zionism somehow is going to have to meld in the technology, maybe look at the idea of a new relationship with its Arab neighbors through technology, doing good in the world by doing well, reaching unfortunate people, if it's the green tech, agri-tech, food tech, whatever it is. I somehow think that's going to be a part of the challenge that you correctly pointed out. I just see one thing on Israel-diaspora relations, and maybe that's not a bad place to end. I mean, the old style was shlilat hagolah, this idea of rejection of the diaspora. I could tell you as a journalist, even when I used to go with Rabin or any place I was going, the prime minister, we'd always visit the Jewish community, and the journalists were just not interested. It became a joke. Dave Makovsky's the pool reporter for the diaspora communities because he likes that stuff. And to me, it wasn't who cared what the journalists thought, but it was that the editors that think was important to cover. But what I see as, used to be American was the largest center of Jewish life in the world. Now Israel has got more population than America, and it's going to the disparity is going to keep growing. And I do see, and you could say, look, this might not be in among the people. You maybe talk about the government and these people. But I do see this feeling of, like, take the Jewish Agency. It was all about immigration, and hopefully it will be. Now the Jewish Agency is kind of under Bougie Herzog, who's now the president, and Natan Sharansky, I should add, has redefined itself by saying, okay, how do we give back? How do we somehow help the Jewish communities that are facing forces of assimilation, that are shrinking, and how do we give them Jewishly? Campus life. I mean, I go around, I made 148 campus visits, dealing with BDS, like and after COVID, it's been all on Zoom. But, how do we have Israel fellows? They're close to 100 of them, Israeli field workers in America. And it's not about Aliyah. It's not about trying to, trying to push people out of the diaspora, bring them to Israel. It's just Jewishly to connect. And I think somehow the affluence, the fact that Israel is becoming indisputably the center of Jewish life as a magnet in a certain way, thinking anew about, instead of rejecting the diaspora, how to engage the diaspora, how to, do Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah, from Zion will come the Torah, not necessarily in a religious sense, but in a cultural sense. And I see Israel as much more inclusive in its thinking. Certainly, without getting into the politics of the new coalition, diaspora minister Nachman Shai, a bunch of these guys, it's not just him, all of them are, it's like, we have to engage. We can't afford to lose it. Because we also know in the U.S., part of our standing is because American Jews care. If they stop caring about this place, that'll fundamentally change our relationship to the U.S. So I don't know. I see a wider vision that you could say is partly driven by necessity and self-interest maybe, but it's also from a point of strength, a magnanimity, that now that Israel's more established, how can it be a resource? How can it reach out? So I do see, elements of a vision that are maybe average Israelis don't see daily, but I see a real evolution in the role of Israel in the relations with diaspora. It's not just America, give us money, but it's more like, how do we connect Jewishly? And that is beautiful to see. So I guess I am an optimist, and I always say, that the resilience of Israel is that ultimately Israel's will to live is greater than its enemies' will to die, and in a very literal sense, than Am Yisrael Chai.
Yeah, I agree on that, and of course, and I'm also bullish on Israel's future, just because I know the society very well, and it has incredible reservoirs of of strength. I don't think very many societies could take the kind of body blows that Israel takes on a yearly basis, and not just survive but thrive as Israel has. I mean, when everything fell apart in 2000, and the peace process was replaced by suicide bombing, and then the disengagement from Gaza was followed by rocket fire, and just a few months ago, people in Tel Aviv were running, into bomb shelters in the middle of the night, and the country just barrels ahead with this incredible force. So I have a lot of faith in the country, but I think that we need a vision. The vision for Israel can't be going to the mall, and buying new shoes. It needs to have a vision. I think we're ripe for one because we don't disagree on that much that's important, and we're still kind of waging these residual wars against secular people against religious people. Well, that's been decided, right? The battle of militant secularism has been lost. This is a Jewish country in the religious sense. Most people here are religious to some extent, traditional, and that's good. We should just live with that. The right-left battle, that's been decided. I mean, we're not going to be socialist. I would like us to be more socialist, and we're certainly more socialist than the United States. But capitalism has won the day. There's not going to be a dramatic agreement with the Palestinians that brings about a two-state reality, not in the near future. So we don't need to wage those battles at the moment. We don't need to have those old fights, the fight between Jews of Middle Eastern extraction, Mizrahim, and Ashkenazim, which is a huge fault line in this country. We need to somehow set that aside, or address it in a way that's constructive, and agree that we all have more common ground than things dividing us, and move ahead. And once we agree that we're fighting stupid battles that don't matter, then I think you could have a block of 80, 90 people in Knesset who can agree on a vision for the Jewish state that is maybe a Noah's Ark of minorities in the Middle East, right? It's the state that saves the Jewish minority in the Middle East, which has been eradicated everywhere else, saves the Jewish minority that's left in Europe, which isn't much of it. It also saves a few others, Druze, the Baha'i, and maybe Arab Christians who are lucky to live in Israel and not a few miles, down the road in Syria or in Lebanon. And that's an interesting way to look at ourselves. Maybe we're a kind of Noah's Ark, and we can demonstrate to the rest of the Middle East what a minority haven looks like. There are other ideas that we could work with, but unless we have a vision for what we're doing, it's going to be hard for us to export our vision to the diaspora. So I think we need to do some internal work, but of course I agree with everything that you said.
I would just say it's ironic that the guy who's now the prime minister in a certain way embodies some of these things. So he should be able, to put that challenge. He's someone who identifies himself as religious, yet his wife, I think by her own admission, is not religious. He's someone who, doesn't want religion to be coercive. And he gave a speech just now saying, the Orthodox have too much political power. He didn't say that they shouldn't, of course, practice religion the way they would like to, of course, but not to be so coercive. I think that is someone who comes out of the technology world. That's how he made his millions, is in tech. He's someone who is presiding over this hybrid along the diverse thing where they have to kind of distill it down to an essence of, okay, so what are we actually doing? So it is interesting that, that you now have a government that is a laboratory, I hope, to say, okay, some of the old fights are just not relevant now. So what are the new challenges? And I urge all our listeners viewers to look at what's unfolding in Israel, because it really is a fascinating experiment, and I'm more hopeful than I've been in a while. So maybe on that note, I just want to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for those words of wisdom, and thanks to everyone at the Shaar, a great Canadian institution, for hosting us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this very special conversation. And thank you to our guests for sharing your wisdom with our community. We'll see everyone back here next week. David Frum in conversation with Janice Stein, American Democracy, a Health Report. We'll see you then. Shalom.